Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Erica Helms. I'm the Chief Advancement Officer here at NYRP, and we're so happy to have you with us this evening. We're thrilled to be hosting a panel of true experts to discuss how we can make the tools of government and policy work for environmental justice. We're so glad that you're taking the time this evening to both hear from our speakers and also to engage with them. Before I hand things over to our moderator, Bill McKibben, I wanted to just tell you a little bit more about New York Restoration Project and our mission. NYRP is a 25-year-old environmental justice nonprofit founded by Bette Midler to help clean and green New York City's community parks and gardens. We own and operate over 50 green spaces citywide, and we manage more than 80 acres of public parkland in northern Manhattan. We also build roughly 24 new gardens with our local community partners every year. Here at NYRP, we believe that access to nature is a fundamental right, and we work to ensure it in New York City neighborhoods where there isn't enough green space. Some of you may know that on average, affluent communities in New York City have 14 acres of open space, while lower income communities have just 6 acres on average. And that includes the schoolyards and playgrounds that were closed for much of the past year due to COVID. So that makes the open space equity issue that much greater. Unequal distribution of open space is a result of planning decisions, and it's also a question of investment. New York City funds its Department of Parks and Recreation at less than 0.5% of the total city budget, but our parks cover 14% of the city. That tells us that we all need to do more to ensure equal access to clean, safe, quality open space for everyone. To overcome the legacy of harmful planning decisions and chronic underfunding, we need to take bold and innovative action for environmental justice. And that's why I'm really eager to hear the broad perspectives of our panelists tonight. They have fought for better planning and policy at the municipal level. They've designed federal legislation. They've even taken a case to the Supreme Court. In short, they have used the tools of our democracy to seek real and lasting change, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them this evening. So on that note, let's start the conversation with our panelists, who are youth climate activist Vic Barrett, Rhiana Gunn-Wright, who is Climate Policy Director at the Roosevelt Institute, Maria Lopez-Nuñez, who is Deputy Director of Organizing and Advocacy at the Ironbound Community Corporation, which is based in Newark, New Jersey, and our moderator, Bill McKibben, whose work you may know as an environmental advocate, writer, and educator. You can read their full and very impressive bios at our website, which is nyrp.org/talks. Throughout the panel, I hope you'll use the Q&A function in the Zoom to submit your questions. We would really love to have your questions. We're going to hold on to them until about 6:45, when Bill will open up the Q&A portion, but please submit those questions throughout as they come to you. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bill and please submit questions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Bill.
Well, Erica, thank you so much, both for this evening and for your work. It's a real pleasure to get to join you all. I got to say, I'm the odd person out here, since I live no longer in the big city at all, but out in the woods in Vermont, where we've got plenty of green space, a shortage of good pizza and bagels and other urban things, but we do have green space. And so this is one of the issues that in the work that you all do, it seems to me of the absolute importance. I remember, as a young man, I covered New York City for the New Yorker. And one of the things I wrote a lot about was community gardens and open space and urban park rangers and things. And I remember being in New York to help out on the day, the fateful day, when it looked like the city government was going to auction off all those community gardens around the city, until Bette Midler stood up at the last minute to make sure that that didn't happen, came forward with the cash to allow so many of those places to continue. I remember there were a lot of people in town that day. I turned the corner to one community garden, and there was 90-year-old David Brower, who had saved the Grand Canyon as the head of the Sierra Club when he was a younger man. And there he was in New York City trying to save a quarter-acre public garden on the Lower East Side. So it was a testament to the power and importance of the work you're doing. And this is precisely the right moment that we should be talking about these questions, because change is afoot, and we need to figure out, how to make that change work as efficiently and effectively as possible for the people and places that need it the very most. And the panel that that you've assembled tonight and that I get to the pleasure of moderating could not be better equipped to do this. And they represent the most interesting and effective spectrum of the work going on right now. And so I'm going to just start turning it over immediately to them. And I'm going to start by asking Vic a question or two. Vic, first of all, when you get started, just describe your arc of your work and what you've been up to. But let me ask you a question. I think the last time I saw you in person may have been in DC a couple of years ago. You were there to help carry on this fight before in the steps of the U.S. Supreme Court in the important case that you were a part of, and to testify before Congress alongside Greta Thunberg and others. And that was a remarkable day, but it did feel a couple of years ago as if we were in kind of enemy territory in Washington, D.C. This was Trump's Washington, and it was pretty clear that the Congress was not going to be particularly helpful on things that really mattered. A lot's changed since the results of the Georgia Senate elections came through in early January, and with the kind of early spring that seems to be happening politically in Washington, we're going to finish just in time tonight for everyone to listen to Joe Biden make the official announcement about the COVID relief bill and the $1.9 trillion in what's essentially an anti-poverty program that's going out. It feels like there's more possibility. So how does it, from your point of view, what does it feel like in the activist community? Where do we point now? How do things look 50 days into a different era?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bill. Yeah, like you said, I will start with a little bit of context on who I am and what I do. So I started doing or just doing climate work when I was in high school, after school programs, learning about climate justice, civic engagement, going to city council, annoying politicians, all of that. And then after doing that for a few years, I got this opportunity to join the Juliana versus United States lawsuit as I was getting expanding frustration with dealing with legislative politicians who I couldn't vote for at the time, so it didn't really feel accountable to me. So like you said, I was in DC talking about the lawsuit, talking about the work we're doing to highlight the fact that the US government violated the Constitution by contributing to the climate crisis in the ways that they have. And it's funny because the lawsuit has seen 3 different administrations. It started under the Obama administration. When we were in DC, it was under the Trump administration. And now it is with the Biden administration. But yeah, like what you were saying about it feeling like enemy territory at the time is definitely on point. I feel like right now we're at a whole different baseline. I remember during testifying, a lot of the Republican Congress members had a lot of really aggressive questions about climate change in general. And I think, as a young person who's trying to make a difference, it's hard to be looking at the people who are supposed to make that difference for you. And you're arguing at a baseline of fact that's I'm trying to talk about environmental racism and how Black people are disproportionately impacted by climate change to people who don't even believe if it's real. So it's a lot of steps to get to that point. So I think that it definitely feels different to be at another baseline. And right now I work in educating young people in civic engagement. And it makes me feel more hopeful to know that they can feel a little more hope that the work that they're going to be doing is going towards something. And there's more space actually for them to be heard and understood in the shifting government atmosphere we're in. Because I would say the last 4 years is definitely an energizing time to get into activism just because of how much there was to fight against, but also a tough time just with, what you had to come up against. And there's still a lot to be talked about too, with just protest laws around the country and things. And on the local level, I live in the I'm from New York originally, but I live in the Midwest now, and in Wisconsin, and line 3 is a huge issue. And there's a lot of things on the local level to still be talking about. But at least we have this more hopeful context, which actually means a lot when it comes to wanting to get up every day and do something about a bunch of big things.
Remind me that we got to come back and talk about line 3 a little bit before we're done, because that's such an important fight and such an interesting one in your neck of the woods right now. But let's turn to Rhiana for a moment, because there's really no one in the country who's done more to kind of force into the center of the policy debate these ideas around environmental justice, and really take them from slogans into things that are highly operational. And they're going to be at the heart, one hopes, of what we see rolling out of Washington in the next while. There's a commitment in the Biden administration to be, as they do environmental spending, to be directing a large proportion of it at environmental justice communities and so on and so forth. So, Rhiana, in a sense, the same question, it must feel a little strange to suddenly be having ideas that when they were first being raised just a few years ago were still, that you had to explain, and that you had to suddenly being the kind of common currency of the most powerful people in our government. So talk about that a little bit, and talk about now what comes next, how we make this as real as we possibly can in the time, whatever time we have before this window closes again.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Yeah, it's been kind of wild. I remember it was like a week or so after, maybe it was really just a couple days after President Biden and Vice President Harris were sworn in. And, the news kept coming out about appointments and that they were going to have an Office of Domestic Climate Policy. And I told folks, I was like, you have to give me a minute, because people were like, what? Well, you do interviews and people ask like, what's going on? What's next? And I was just like, listen, I'm not used to winning, so you have to give me some time. Like, this is a different situation. And I definitely cannot take credit for environmental justice at the center. People have been doing that for decades. I think, if anything, what I did and what the Green New Deal did is sort of combine those arguments with a set of arguments about economic transformation and the ways in which climate change is really attributable to how we run and structure our economy, and what is possible, not just in terms of emissions, but in terms of job creation, in terms of economic inequality, and actually having more equality and equity when it comes to wealth and income. Just really talking about what is possible also in terms of our economy when we turn towards climate policy, and particularly also environmental justice. And so that has been really exciting. And it is sort of a bizarre feeling when we first, so the Green New Deal, I started working on the Green New Deal in September of 2018. The sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office that sort of sparked all the press coverage was in November, and then the resolution came out in February. And since then, we've just been, and particularly, I should say, I have been working on sort of advancing that vision and figuring out how do you turn that into concrete policy and narrative, other shifts in narrative that are necessary. And so it's still, though, wild, because the things that we were saying, right, that climate, that really investing in climate and clean energy could generate millions of jobs, right? That a more green economy can be a more just economy if you structure it in the right ways. All of that, things people laughed at me about. Uh, and I'm just thinking of the people who laughed at me personally, not just the people who laughed at the ideas like on CNN. But it was really that sort of idea also that equity did have a place in climate policy, even if you were talking about it economically. All of that was just, it felt like much more taboo 3 years ago. So it is a very big shift to hear President Biden, right, say these things in his speeches, and also to see the cabinet and the folks that he's appointed, right? There's a real climate focus across literally everywhere, from Treasury to the Federal Reserve to, to Department of Interior. So that is all really exciting. So I think what is next, it's a number of things. So the COVID relief package doesn't include really anything about climate. The Biden and Harris administration was very open about that this was going to be very much about relief, and they were going to deal with that next. And so there's still a huge fight to actually make sure there is a second recovery package that does invest in climate. That's not a done deal. That is not, they have said that that is what they want to do. It's not promised, it's not created, and it's certainly not on the floor. And so that is definitely a next move. Another move is financial regulators are really important, particularly in terms of moving money away from fossil fuels. They've committed to sort of creating a climate cabinet and treasury, but we still have to really keep pressure up to make sure those appointments happen. And that the Federal Reserve and Treasury are doing things like working on climate disclosure, right? They're really trying to think about the role that climate change plays in our financial system. And then I think the last thing that is not just about climate, but an across the board need is abolishing the filibuster and really creating a lot of pressure, particularly from progressive groups, to abolish the filibuster. I tell people all the time, the same institutions that you need to run a Green New Deal are the same institutions you need for a functioning multiracial democracy, right? If we didn't have an electoral college, how much easier would it be to get climate policy passed, right? If Black and brown people's votes mattered as much as everyone else's, would we have to spend so much time focused on climate deniers, knowing that people of color are far more likely to care about climate change, to agree that climate policy needs to happen? And just like the filibuster, the things that we're talking about, including that 40% investment in frontline communities, that can't happen without filibuster reform. That is not something that can happen through budget reconciliation or any manner of just sort of like trying to tweak parliamentary rules. Is not going to work. And so really a lot of the things we might be able to put a lot of money into climate through, say, budget reconciliation or some of those things, but making sure that it goes to the people who have been marginalized and that the investments actually help change power relationships in our economy requires laws that require filibuster reform.
Well, so let's follow that for a minute, that thread. Let's role play a little bit. You get to sit down with Joe Manchin, who's emerged as the kind of prime minister of the United States at this point, who gets to decide on a lot of things, it looks like. Make the case to him for why we need, not forget about filibuster reform for a minute and the For the People Act and all these things but just lay out the case, because he may not have heard it quite, about environmental equity and about why that's something that he better be able to bring back home to his constituents in West Virginia.
Right. Yeah, so there's a few things. So I'm going to try to make this argument concise because there are a lot of things to say about this. But okay, let's start from the top. So there's like two two things that we're facing. Well, there's a number of things we're facing as an economy, but let's just focus on two. The first is that millions of jobs have gone away, and not all of them have come back, and not all of them will come back. And we need a way to create new jobs, not only to replace those jobs, but jobs that are of higher quality than what we have now. So right now, we have an economy that has just taken a hit in millions of jobs, and also an economy that hadn't fully recovered from the last recession. So we're down a lot in terms of output and productivity. The second thing that we're talking about is that the fossil fuel industry, as much as we sort of talk about how many jobs it creates, and that is real, right? There is no denying that the fossil fuel industry does employ people, and often at quite good benefit levels, right? Like these are places with long histories of employee power, and so of worker power. And so these are places that have been unionized, and so these are also good jobs. A lot of them are good jobs, at least in terms of money. So you have that issue that you need to replace good jobs, but you also have to notice that the fossil fuel industry is actually increasingly an inherent risk to our economy, because it's an industry that's going to have to go away, right? It's an industry that is fueling a lot of, right, physical damage, storms and whatnot, that as they worsen, it's going to become even more necessary to get off fossil fuels more quickly. So you're dealing with an industry that is going to, even in the best case scenario, have a very messy wind down. And that because it's something that we don't need forever, right? And also the rest of the world is moving towards green power. It means that the more that we sort of put fossil fuels at the center of our economy, the riskier the health of our economy is, particularly the medium and the long term, right? And so one thing that's really amazing about investing in climate policy and green technologies and whatnot is that actually creates the potential for what people can call a green boom, right? A lot of jobs, a hot labor market, where workers then have more power, and also innovation that can last for decades, right? Just like if we continue to invest in fossil fuels, the effects of that will last for decades, both in terms of emissions and in terms of our economy. And so if you're talking about a country with an economy that needs strengthening, something that they can invest in that will do that, and the fact that we can design those investments so that they help folks, so that all the wealth doesn't end up at the top the way that it did now, and we have the same sort of problems, you have a situation where it just doesn't make any sense not to take advantage of that potential and not to make those investments, particularly when nothing else promises to create that volume of jobs, that volume of growth. There's nothing else even remotely similar in terms of scale, and in terms of economic transformation, and in terms of sort of a kickstart for our economy. So that's sort of what I would tell Joe Manchin.
Since I'm playing Joe Manchin, you've convinced me, and I'm on board, and I'm getting rid of the filibuster, and here we go. That's just the right pitch, and it was really powerful. Let's take this down to the local level for a little while. That's where NYRP works a lot, and that's really where Maria Lopez-Nuñez has done such amazing work over the last few years. Maria, we've actually never met, but I've interviewed you, given the COVID situation, I've gotten to interview you by email for my New Yorker column. But it's a real pleasure to get to talk with you tonight. You're coming to us from across the river in Newark and in the Ironbound section, and talk about winds. I mean, your work on S-232, is that right, in New Jersey last year was a huge, huge environmental justice win. I remember reading about it and about and flashing back to the very beginning of the environmental justice world, when Dr. Robert Bullard 40 years ago was the first person to map out the fact that we were putting harmful industries in communities of color and so on and so forth. Um, this is one of the most impressive attempts to deal with that. Would you talk about it a little bit and about how it got passed and about what lessons it holds for how we think about this on a larger level going forward?
Yeah, for sure. And I guess first I'll say, because a lot of folks from New York really don't realize the deep and intimate relationship that Newark has with New York City. Because in Newark we are, like you said, right across the river, but we're host to a lot of the waste infrastructure for the city of Newark. So in not my city, but my neighborhood, right? So the 4 square miles, we have the state largest garbage incinerator, of which 50% of the trash actually comes from Manhattan, right? So when I think about our relationship, it's like a lot of people don't know it. They come in through Newark, maybe they land here at the port of Newark, where millions of people travel through, but they never realize like the rich city or the stolen from city that's right next to them, right? Because we also, in my neighborhood, we're right next to the port of Newark, which is where 80% of the consumer goods, right, in this metropolitan, the beating heart of capitalism, where they're consumed, right? And for anything to get out of the port after it comes, from overseas on those barges, which are also diesel operated, it gets onto a truck. And those trucks only have a couple of different routes, and they either go through the Southward neighborhood or through the Eastward, which is the Ironbound. And so we're dealing with that. We're dealing with the stuff when people flush the toilet, when people recycle, all of that. A lot of that infrastructure, even for the city of New York, is right here in Newark, right? Which I always like to highlight. And in my neighborhood, like I said, we have the state largest garbage incinerator. We have a waste treatment plant, which deals with the waste of 5 million people, a fat rendering plant, 2 power plants, and we're right next to the port, and we're bordered by the longest Superfund site in the country, which is the Passaic River, where we were producing Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, right? And we were just dumping the byproducts into the river, and then all that dust was everywhere. So anyway, I could go on and on about neighborhood, but I think it's important to just lay it out of what I'm talking about, because then the law, S232, what it does is we call it the cumulative impacts law, right? And it's the environmental justice law. And what I feel super fortunate is that I'm on the shoulder of giants, right? In the environmental justice movement that's been going since before even the 90s, since even before Bob Bullard. Like, our people have known just by the lived experience of how bad it gets in our neighborhoods. No one needs to tell you that it's probably racism that makes it look that way, right? So it's nothing new, and we've been talking about a just transition. But for us to even think about a new world, we have to think about how we fight the bad. And one thing as an organizer is just, it was always whack-a-mole, right? Like a new facility, new permit hearing, and then you organize your people, you go to the hearing, and you realize there's no way, the law doesn't see you. Like, the law does not see the concentration of pollution in your neighborhood, and it considers every industry like an individual, so American. Everybody is just by themselves, and it doesn't matter like the context that they're in. And what the law does, it makes the law see us, right? It makes them say, what is the context? When you have that concentration of pollution in a neighborhood, then it mandates that the Department of Environmental Protection say no. And that's what makes it the strongest in the country. It's not just like, oh, make a statement, do an analysis. It's like, once you've done that and you're in an EJ community that's defined by a community that's predominantly people of color, 40%, or linguistic isolation, or 35% low income people, if it's that and you're trying to get something new, and you're going to add to our burden, then it mandates that the state say no. And if you're trying to get your renewal, then it mandates that you get some conditions applied to your permit so that we can also start cleaning up the act, But first we need to learn to say no in this country, which is a really hard thing for us to say no to industry. And that's why I'm hoping that the next people that pass that law, it gets even stronger as it makes its way, because we kind of set the bar, I think, pretty high in New Jersey.
I think it's one of the most interesting and powerful laws that in the whole country, and sort of exemplifies what we were talking about a little bit earlier with Rhiana, that just, 5 years ago, it was hard to even name this stuff. And now all of a sudden we're taking serious action on it. And it really just demonstrates the power of movements, I think, to really start putting pressure. Vic, let's
talk start, Bill, if I could interrupt. It's not start, because like under Trump, New Jersey was under Chris Christie before Trump. So
Yeah.
we didn't start like putting pressure as we saw Biden coming. Under Governor
no.
Christie, it couldn't pass on the state level, so we passed it in the city of Newark. And I think that that's how we need to pass federal stuff too, is bottom up, right?
Yep.
Like the federal needs to get its cues because there's a lot of beautiful things happening on the local and state level that the federal government needs to pay attention to because our communities have been organizing even while Trump was in office.
I really want to get back to that because, among other things, New York City is about to have an important mayoral race, and really in play are a lot of these policy questions in fascinating ways. Vic, let's talk for a second about this, about what Maria was saying about saying no to things, because that is, I mean, these are the two halves of this. We've got to stop things that are bad, and then we've got to set the work, set the possibilities for what Rhiana's talking about, for these, deep, serious, affirmative changes. One of the things that that's going on up in your part of the world right now is this Line 3 fight in Wisconsin and Minnesota with heavy leadership from indigenous communities, and yet it's a example of a project that's being backed by not by Trump or Christie, but by the Democratic governor of Minnesota, who's given the permission to go ahead. So it's a reminder that there's not all, tell us a little bit about where that fight stands. And then in a broader sense, talk a little bit about what, the youth climate movement hit its absolute peak in the fall of 2019 with those giant climate strikes. And then everybody had to go inside and out of the street. And so talk a little bit about what the youth climate movement's been doing in the meantime, and what to look for as the pandemic, knock on wood, begins to recede.
Yeah. There's a few things there. So I'll start with Line 3, which I feel like is an epitome of so many of the things we're talking about. Like, also, don't mind if my cat joins a little. How cats know when they're not being paid attention to. So they're like, all right, cool. I'm gonna come join then. But yeah, so just for context, if people don't know, Line 3 is a massive pipeline that's being proposed. It would be one of the largest, if not the largest, crude oil. And oil is like the dirtiest, like most disgusting type. Crude oil pipeline that would be going from Canada down to Wisconsin. Obviously through just like the worst route it could take, through treaty land, through indigenous territory, under rice fields. There's man camps in a lot of that area. There's been a lot of issues with missing and murdered indigenous women, which comes along with pipeline infrastructure a lot of the times. Just a fight that's like highlighting all of the intersections and complexities of the climate crisis, highlighting that it's not just infrastructure and it's not just CO2. It's also like communities and being able to feed families. And yeah, it's just like the crux of everything. And also happening in a context in which people are taking direct action in civic and civil disobedience in states like Wisconsin. And I'm not actually totally positive on Minnesota, but in states like Wisconsin, where it's been on the table to make it like federally illegal to protest pipelines. And so that's like the context of all of that happening right now. And it's been a massive fight going on for years, honestly, in this part of the world. And I'm not a Midwest native, so I'm learning about this and just now like learning a lot about the organizations that are working on it by getting involved in nonprofits on the ground here. But yeah, just a massive, and exactly like you pointed out, Bill, like Tim Walz of Minnesota is a Democratic governor. And it's coming from Canada. It's run by Justin Trudeau, who's definitely, like supposed to be, I don't know, centrist, leftist, whatever. But like, it just shows kind of the no bounds that this has, and especially just the power of these industries. And like you said, Maria, like we just have to learn to say no, but they're just so powerful. Like Enbridge has been trying to build this pipeline forever, and when they couldn't build it for a second, they just invested in the Dakota Access Pipeline, and then they figured they could build it again, and they went back to, you know, trying to get this permit passed. And there's already issues with what's in the ground, with it being abandoned and left behind. And yeah, it's wild, because I'm growing up in New York, we used to talk about pipeline fights, and I remember being so excited when fracking was banned and things like that. And coming out here, I've been just, it's interesting when you like leave places you grow up and look at just the whole country, just like all these fights. And it's like, sometimes it just feels like it's always for the same thing, and that's a pattern we need to recognize. And I guess that's what government's supposed to do, right? But and then the second part of your question, you know, yeah, fall of 2019 was huge in terms of the youth climate movement. We were all out on the streets. Felt like I was everywhere. I feel like I saw you at least like 10 times in those 3 months. But yeah, and with the pandemic coming, it's just been a really interesting time to be a young Christian trying to organize and like activate around anything really, especially that's not like already the really stark reality that's in your face. I think for me, kind of like the way that I've navigated it has been kind of seeing the COVID crisis and seeing the climate crisis and so many of the parallels running in between them. I think it's been like affirming kind of in just like how much grassroots like community care, mutual aid networks is important. And I think it's kind of beneficial maybe to the youth climate movement actually for us all to get a chance to go home, you know, and get out of DC or New York or wherever we're at, or whatever conference we're at, or wherever we're lobbying, and, you know, be in our communities for this last year and see where the most help is needed. And I've been working with the Alliance for Climate Education with young high school students in Madison, and I have coworkers that are working with young high school students in New York, like having virtual meetings and talking about all this stuff, because, you know, there's still young people who care and they still have outlets they want to get out there. And this is an opportunity for us to think really creatively about, you know, staying true to our grassroots, like in our communities and what's right next to us, and also creatively thinking about decentralized networks for change, I would say, is like how the pandemic is sort of framed. I don't want to say young people's work in general, but like what I've noticed.
Yeah. Well, that's really important. And one of the things, of course, that's happened over that 18 months is that and this goes straight to questions around New York, is that there's been a huge evolving focus around the big banks and things that are funding all this kind of destruction, including the banks that are funding Line 3. So that's one of the places I think we're going to see a lot of action as the pandemic comes to a close. Let's go with that, Rhiana. Let's go with what both Vic and Maria have been saying is really interesting. That there's a lot to be said for the idea that that there are communities that are going to be able to be ahead of the curve here, and kind of setting an example and leading. We look at a city like New York City, which has passed some pretty remarkable laws in the last year or two, including all this work around retrofitting buildings and so on and so forth, that seem to carry promise for lots of jobs and lots of emission cuts and things. What are you looking at as you look around the country and look at local stuff that we can blow up and magnify to make to take to scale as fast as possible? What are the things that are exciting you? Oh, you've got to unmute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, that's a really good question. There's a lot of things that are really exciting. I mean, New York is particularly exciting, I think, right now for a number of reasons. One of which is that 40% commitment to frontline communities is modeled after New York Renews, which was, and now is part of New York law in the CCPLA, the sort of the landmark, one of the pieces of landmark climate legislation that they passed in the last year. And so I, in my work, have been looking really closely at that, because a lot of the questions that they're working on now about how do you implement that commitment, they're very similar to the questions that we are going to have to ask at the federal level about how do you implement that commitment? How do you figure out, how do you define what's a frontline community? How do you figure out where that is? How do you match that to an investment, right? Who controls those investments? How do you have democratic control, right? Because what we know too is that what is exciting, I mean, what's happening in New York as a city is exciting, right? But you still need sub local control, right? Communities are the reasons that they made those commitments in the first place, right? So those same communities need to have a say in how the money is administered, who controls it, where does it go? But we don't have a lot of models for how to do that. And we haven't had that sort of close federal, local, state partnership probably since the Great Society New Deal, right? We've had these moments of it, but in terms of how do you do that long term or in a standing way, we don't know. And that's a question that we're having to figure out. I think along those same lines, I think this is work that's happening with organizers across the country, but particularly I've been talking to some folks who did in fact, receive federal funding for legislation at their organizations. And one of the questions that they have been grappling with, and that's really important, is like, how do you make sure that small companies, small contractors, small organizations can access these funds, right? Because taking in federal grants that's a whole, people have to hire, organizations have to hire someone to manage that paperwork sometimes. It's not a small thing. And so when we say something and we say, oh, we'll just fund it through grants, what you could really mean is this money is going to go to the widest, most powerful nonprofits in this area, right? This money is going to go to the folks who it always goes to through city government, right? The favorite pastor or whatever, right? Like, and so we have to figure out ways to do that. And then I think some other stuff that we've been looking at is, so Illinois, this is going to get very nerdy. Illinois has a Sustainable Investment Act, which essentially requires all funds, like pension funds, and all sort of funds that are administered in Illinois to disclose information about their impact on carbon emissions, et cetera, and to take that into account when they're building investment portfolios. And so it's not a mandate, but it is strongly, it's the strongest thing really we've seen from a state to say that, like, hey, actually, we're not going to let state pension money go fund fossil fuels, right? Whoever is managing this money for our workers needs to tell us where it's going. And that's important. Again, this is very nerdy, because a lot of times, so there's something like upwards of $30 trillion just in pension funds. So that's money that is from workers, but the funds who invest it right now are by law only required to look at short-term returns. They don't have to invest in, which means they can invest in fossil fuels and not have to think about how that's actually hurting beneficiaries, how that's destroying the environment, how that's actually not in their benefit. So changing fiduciary duty makes it possible to then say, actually, you have to manage this fund for the benefit of the people who invested the money, not the benefit of the fund itself, right? And that actually then means that you can have a lot more contestation about what these big asset managers are putting money into, and force them to say, actually, it's not just about short-term gain. If you are funding the eventual sort of decimation of the climate, you are actually not acting in the best interest of your beneficiaries, and you have to behave differently. And so that's some of the work, but like Illinois is we haven't done that at the federal level. So right, so that is a good example, and I'll stop there because they just get nerdier
Those are
as we
great
go
examples, and
on.
very close to my heart, since this stuff around um, pensions and things and divestment is really key. And we have good news from New Jersey on that score just yesterday. The State University of New Jersey, which the world knows as Rutgers, announced that it was divesting from fossil fuel. Um, um, that's something that the New York State and New York City pension funds have now committed to do. And it's actually interesting. There's a big drive underway to try and convince Governor Murphy in New Jersey to do the same thing, to follow that lead. So, Maria, this is maybe this is just an example of this, but this goes to a question that someone was raising in the Q&A, and it's time for us to be paying attention, me to be paying attention to what other people want to know, not just me, because I am always greedy for information. But you know, you've learned a lot about how to navigate government, how to make change happen, Maria, because you've got this law that really is you and your colleagues made things happen that no one else has made happen in other places. What are the kind of power rules that you learned in the course of doing that? What didn't you know when you started, and what do you know now? And in particular, to go back to kind of what Vic was talking about, what's the kind of magic formula between outside and inside work here, between pressure and persuasion?
What a loaded question. It's really soon to say I have magic sauce here or that any of my colleagues do. You know, we just passed that law. It was just signed in September. So one thing I've definitely learned is you have to stay with it. Like everyone was with us as we were signing the law. It was all, you know, the attention was on us, and now we have to implement that law and make sure that those rules, you know, so I was really feeling and getting nerdy because that's my life these days. Right now I'm missing, but I'm getting text updates about the public rulemaking, because that's also one of the unique parts of the law is that it forces public participation. We're not just going to get a draft in a year that then we comment on. No, like every step of the law we get to have input on, which is super important. But what did I learn? I learned that first off, like you have to have communities of color, the directly impacted frontline communities at the table. There's no shortcuts to that. Like you can't have another group that's an outsider group kind of try to just, oh, well, we know how to pass policy. Because you know what? I'm sure that if we had allowed someone else to take the work from out of our hands, that they would have negotiated it down, that they would have watered the law down. It wouldn't have been as strong. But because it's life and death for us, there was no compromising. You know, it's a battle that's for S-232 that's been going on in New Jersey for 12 years. So it was not easy work, and it was not overnight work. I want to be clear on that. It was not successful. I was not here the whole 12 years. You know, I came in, and it's about building power, both like you said, inside baseball, but making sure we can back it up. And that's where organizations like the Ironbound, we have a substantial base, you know, like if we need to mobilize our members, we will, and we will show up. So any threat that is made at a negotiating table is not like an empty threat, you know, like we have the numbers and the movement to back it up and to force people into a corner and to hold people to their word, right? Which I think, like I said, there's a lot of parallels coming out of Christie, then getting Governor Murphy with Trump and now Biden, right? And lessons that I've learned of how you have to hold people to their word and remind them who their constituents are, who got them in office, and the fact that we're watching, because oftentimes they think our communities are stupid and they could, you know, just do some symbolic measures, sprinkle some dust, and we fooled, you know, but it's not like that. And that's what I think we bring when we're at the table, is that uncompromising and lived experience that no expertise, no amount of like research or science can ever really take the place of lived experience.
How do you, this goes to a question that someone was asking in the chat, and we'll start with you. Sometimes you can get policymakers on board, but then you've got these entrenched deep departments that have to carry out the regulations. And there can be a lot of bureaucratic, you know, a lot of sort of capture of those departments and things by the industries they're supposed to regulate, or they're just, you know, inertia and the old way of doing things and so on and so forth. How do you light a fire under those guys?
Well, I'll let you all in on a secret. I'm sure that the department had the power to do what the law makes them do. Now, I'm sure that they had the power to do that before. They just didn't want to, right? And then definitely there's the question of what are the memos that departments write to legislators? You know, I'll say that we can read between the lines. And I think it does speak to people in bureaucracies and departments making it a political thing. You know, like they're not used to political pressure for anyone, especially not communities of color, actually knowing what they're up to, paying attention to the rules, paying attention to how they implement the rules, and bringing more scrutiny to the departments. Oftentimes, they're bureaucrats who have survived, you know, administration, you know, different parties, but they're still there. And that always makes me wonder, what do we need to do differently? Because it's, you know, like the administration changes, the bureaucrats don't, they've survived, they're doing something. And how do we get them to do something different? You know, just to be very clear about that. And I think bringing attention, the sort of political attention we bring to elected officials, to also bring that to bureaucrats that are in positions that should still be, they're still civil servants who should be accountable to people and to communities.
I think this is a really key question. You know, we're going to be celebrating tomorrow or the next day when the Senate confirms Deb Haaland as the first Native American cabinet member in history. And, you know, she's going to be in charge of the department that controls 1/5 of the acreage that got taken from her ancestors, which is pretty cool if you ask me. But it's not going to be easy because there are, you know, tens of thousands of people out work in that department who are used to doing things in a particular way and maybe very closely tied to the industries that used to dominate the Department of the Interior and so on. So Rhiana, when one's thinking about a situation like that, how do you design policy so that it takes, so that it's a little bit less at the discretion of, you know, so you take away some of that wiggle room for the people who are going to actually be implementing this stuff on the ground?
Yeah, so I think of a couple of things. The first is that um, I try to think of what would it take for there to be no excuses for this thing to not get done. So I think the first thing I think about is that sometimes there's just legitimate like capacity deficits. These departments often have strained budgets. They're running on not full staff. And depending on what you are asking them to do, they might have someone who did that before, they might not. Um, and they might not know how to do the thing that you're asking, particularly when you're talking federal to state. I shouldn't say it's easy, but like the federal government does not infrequently tell states to do things that they might not know how to do or don't have experience doing. So how do you, in thinking about an initiative, I always think about like it should probably come with money for administration, not probably, basically always, so that if you're asking for a new thing, you're providing the resources to do that. um, the other thing is there sort of appropriate technical assistance, right? If you're asking them to do a thing, is there someone who can help walk them through how to do that thing? And so I think of those as sort of like, let's assume like benefit of the doubt, what would you need to get this done? Let's talk about, because also when you change the material conditions, sometimes you can change how people feel or go about them when it's not like, oh, you're just making me do this thing that I don't have the means to do. I think the second thing is governance, right? Like a lot of times if you look at laws, they're not particularly they don't necessarily say anything definite about governance. Sometimes they do, but sometimes it's left squishy just for that express purpose of allowing there to be more space for folks to play. And so I think about that a lot. Like, what is this saying about governance? How do we get that tight? And then the last thing is I think that for particularly for like big changes, you have to think about these things as not just um you're going to do them, not just like the law passed, you're going to do them, but as matters of organizational change, because they can be. And so also I think it's incumbent on the local level or whoever is, you know, who's in charge of that administration that's over those departments, thinking about like, okay, this is going to require organizational change. Who needs to be there? Who do I need to hire at the top? Whatever. So there is something about what's in law, but there's also things that are not about what's in law. That's just about how do you approach this, knowing that you are trying to get people who have been doing a thing a certain way to do it differently. And how do you approach that as sort of an organizational change problem? Because ultimately it's about people. You're just trying to move people to do a different thing.
That's a very powerful and useful set of very specific, and it seems to me, smart responses. We're almost out of time and we have to go quickly. So let me end by asking about quickness. You know, I think that climate denial of the overt kind got on the airplane with Trump to Mar-a-Lago, and I don't think it's coming back. But I also don't think that we're moving anywhere near at the speed that the science tells us we need to move now. So Vic, you go first, and then Maria and Rhiana, you get the last word. Just a few words on how to make things happen faster than we're used to having them happen, faster than are convenient or comfortable for governments or economies. What things are you thinking about right now?
Yeah, I think for me, what comes to mind is like, well, I work for a climate education org right now, but like education, and like not just in the general sense, but in like the really hard hitting sense, the type that makes you uncomfortable and is fully immersive and like breaks down people's ideas of things that of like notions they weren't considering, which I know is not something that happens fast, but I think is something that is necessary for us to take the fast steps afterward to have the whole picture, whole thinking solutions we need for the climate crisis.
It's good. Maria, your turn.
Listening to communities that are the most directly impacted, like not asking them to prove that that solution is going to work, but trusting that their lived experience is showing us the way. You know, getting all the allies need to actually get behind those most directly impacted.
That's good too. Rhiana, you're the master of the detail and the grinding it out. But if you had to light a firecracker under people's rear ends, what's the way to make things happen fast now?
I would actually say focusing on changes to the social safety net in some sense. The safer people feel, the more likely they are to be comfortable with drastic change. And ultimately, what we're trying to do when we say go fast is get people more comfortable with making these things. We're trying to get people to go along. And so if we aren't making them feel safe and like they have something to fall back on, they're not going to move. They're going to fight over what they have.
That is the absolutely perfect ending and segue to the president, Mr. Biden, who's going to be talking about what we've just signed today, which is the biggest expansion of the social safety net, maybe since the LBJ era, and a really interesting moment in our history. I cannot thank the three of you enough, not just for what you said in the last hour, though that was great, but mostly for the incredible work that you've all been doing. I got to say, it makes me, I mean, it's hard to get me too optimistic. You know, I wrote the first book about all of this and it had the cheerful title, The End of Nature. So I'm not I'm not necessarily always the most optimistic guy in the world, but I come away from this hour at least convinced we're going to give it one hell of a try. So thank you all enormously for what you do. And Erica, thank you so much for what NYRP does and for convening us all here for this gathering tonight.
Thank you so much, Bill. We're so grateful to you for moderating tonight, and we're really grateful to you, Maria and Vic and Rhiana, for sharing your experience and your ideas and your analysis and your vision, and helping, I think, everyone who's listening to understand how the experience at the local level can and should influence what happens at the state and federal level. Very, very inspiring and really full conversation. We thank you so much for being here tonight. And we will definitely be sharing a recording of this conversation. So for our audience, we thank you for being here, and we encourage you to share the recording with others that you know who would benefit from hearing this really important conversation. So we thank you. We wish everyone a good night, and we look forward to seeing you at another event soon.
Take care all.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.